Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Global Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we are very fortunate once again to welcome back Professor Jonathan Haslam of Cambridge, who's the author of numerous books on Soviet diplomacy, Russian diplomacy, and the author most recently of Hubris, an outstanding work of history of NATO, the war in Ukraine. And now a paperback edition of the book has come out, so that's very timely to have the interview. And a lot has happened since we last spoke. We've had Trump taking over in the Oval Office. We've had variety of peace initiatives. We've had 4 telephone conversations between Presidents Trump and Putin. We've had meetings between Lavrov and Rubio, and phone conversations between them, peace plans, meetings in Istanbul. But before we get to all of that, there's a question I want to ask, which is in a recent appearance on the Glenn Greenwald podcast, you were interviewed by Aaron Matter. You said something very interesting. You said Russia cannot win this war, Ukraine cannot win this war, and Europe most certainly cannot win this war, and which was very striking. And it raises 2 very obvious questions. First of all, many commentators, analysts say that Russia cannot but win this war. It has the resources, the strength, the size to prevail eventually. And then the other question is, well, if no one can win this war, why are we well into the 4th year of this conflict? So, do you want to take it away and just answer what you meant by that intriguing comment?
Yes, I mean, originally, Putin hoped to overwhelm Ukraine, as notoriously said, in 2 to 3 days. This was the CIA's assessment of
Yeah,
his.
but those were not Putin's words.
No, but they
And
were.
there is no evidence that that came from the Russian Defense Ministry or the Foreign Ministry. This
No,
is
the
a
foreign
talking this is
ministry.
a talking point.
The foreign ministry was opposed to the operation, as
It
was.
doesn't matter, okay? What matters is where we are right now. I mean, I found it really intriguing too. I mean, so everyone loses this war. What does that mean?
Well, if I can get a word in, um, originally Putin hoped to win by a blitzkrieg. This was premised on an assessment of Ukraine by rather bad FSB intelligence officers and some corrupt inside knowledge. So from that time onwards, from February 2022 onwards, it's not clear to me that Putin's advisors have persuaded him that Ukraine is something entirely different from what he presupposed. And what he presupposed was that really the regime did not have an internal consensus that would be strong enough to survive external attack. To my mind, for him to give up entirely, he would have to be convinced of that. And reading Russian commentary, which is tricky, I don't believe he is convinced of that. So there's this extraordinary polarity of views, because in Europe, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, there's a belief that somehow Ukraine can prevail. That's to say, not just hold out, but eventually cause the Russians to give up entirely. That's the sort of polar opposite. With the Americans, it's not at all clear that they have a well worked out means of securing Putin's consent to end the war on anything that would be a genuine compromise with Ukraine at the expense of Russia, of the territory that Russia has already conquered. So um, this process of war, the destructiveness of war, seems to me not to have in any way altered some of the fundamental assumptions on the Russian side, which it has to do if we are to make any progress. The Europeans, God knows, I find their assessments varied and difficult to understand, seem to believe that if you arm Ukraine to the teeth, you give them weapon systems that enable them to reach well inside Russia, somehow this will solve the problem. I don't know what you think of that, but to my mind, this will create a much more severe escalation of the crisis.
But
So
why?
I'm not optimistic.
But just to answer, the question I raised, why wouldn't Russia eventually prevail? I mean, it would take some
Well,
time, but
it
given the
also,
resources that Russia has at its disposal, its industry, its population, its military, why wouldn't it eventually prevail?
well, and also, then how do you explain the negotiations in Istanbul in March and April of 2022? It was all but signed. I mean, the entire premise that Russia was going to take over in 3 days, that's illusory. It looked like the Russians were getting exactly what they wanted. They made a show of force. The Ukrainians wanted to negotiate, and in retrospect, it was a damn good deal for the Ukrainians. So I'm kind of mystified by your first answer because it's as if the first Istanbul process didn't even happen.
No, the setbacks that the Russians received in those early months were enough, uh, I think, to cause Putin to have doubts, and those who had originally opposed the operation, which I think was most institutions associated with foreign affairs.
Well, was Istanbul a good deal for Ukraine?
I think it was about as good a deal as they were ever going to get.
Okay, we can agree on that. Yeah.
And that was blocked, as we know, by Boris Johnson in the name of NATO, which I think has um, consequences for the lives of so many Ukrainians and Russians. And unfortunately, the British did this. We now know with a sort of bravadura. They were going to try and lead NATO and make a name for themselves in the situation in which Biden was somewhat vacant. This was the British aim. And unfortunately, that aim has revived under the new prime minister. But I mean, I always felt that this war would either be settled very quickly or not for a very long time. That opportunity, as you mentioned, was lost. I thought when Trump was going to come in, I thought we were back to square one, where we could do something very, very quickly by decisive action on the part of the United States. But this didn't happen. And the whole thing has got dragged out again, so much so as we've got chaotic proposals on the European side, intermitting with, how shall I say, disrupted attention on the side of the Americans. And then the personal factors, as you know, when Zelensky went to Washington, we had these disastrous meetings, which meant Zelensky was incredibly badly informed about how to deal with Mr. Trump.
But yesterday, during his meeting with uh, Chancellor Merz, Trump said something very interesting and something he hasn't said before, which is, well, maybe we should just let this go on for a while. It's like two children fighting in the park. There's no reason to disrupt them. Let them go on fighting for a while. Now, Chancellor Merz obviously wasn't very happy with that response, but it might suggest that Trump's view now is, well, let this go on for a while, and at some point, when Ukraine realizes that it cannot prevail, and then eventually Russia is inevitably going to prevail, that's the moment when you move forward with some kind of a peace plan.
I think the problem, I mean, I'm guessing, I think the problem on the American side at the moment is that we have midterm elections coming up. Everything is subordinate to domestic politics in the US at the moment. This big, beautiful bill supposedly has got to be got through. It's not. It's taking a lot of trouble. Trump has fallen out with Elon Musk. It seems to me Trump's policy, to the extent that it was coherent domestically, is beginning to look a little fragile. The tariffs issue is another thing. The long-term bonds are doing the wrong thing, so American debt is a major problem. Trump has no control over the Federal Reserve. So, in other words, at home, there's too much chaos to contemplate elections coming up in the autumn. I don't think that, given the sort of me first attitude of Trump, that we are going to solve any foreign policy problem before then, because he won't be focusing his mind on it. And I think when you look at the FBI, or what is the State Department doing, Marco Rubio, their attention is not focused on this problem. It's all over the place. And in fact, Marco Rubio's intention has now become focused on the issue of deportations, which is, of course, a vote winner. It's not a vote loser, whereas foreign policy is nothing in terms of votes. So I worry about this, the cyclicality of the American electoral process feeding into this situation. The Russians who don't the Russians around Putin don't really understand the United States. There are a lot of Russians who do, but the ones close to him are, as a result of this war, I think, have become more and more sort of self-obsessed, self-absorbed, and unable to sort of see outside of the window clearly enough. And there are one or two people I've been reading recently who take a long view, who take the view that this is all about putting US-Russian relations back in the box, of creating this not intimacy, but the closeness between the two, as it were, major superpowers. This is the long view. I've not seen anything written in the short term in terms of a deal involving Ukraine, which is at all convincing to anybody. In other words, at the moment, people like Lavrov are asking for everything, and they're not going to get it. And unfortunately, the arrival in Washington of the man they say is really running Ukraine, that's to say, the main advisor to Zelensky, got nowhere. He wanted photo opportunities with Trump. He didn't get them. He had a strange photo op with Marco Rubio where you can barely see them together.
Yeah, walking away from him. Yeah,
exactly. I think exactly that point. It just caught the state of relations as they are. And I think we've got a situation where Trump used this very unfortunate analogy of kids in the playground. In one sense, he caught one truth, which was that the ego of the two sides is itself a major obstacle. There's no way he should have said what he said, but that catches some of it. In other words, what he's saying is, I cannot bring these two sets of people together to see sense, because they're acting on emotion. And I mean, my goodness, he knows what that's like. We've seen recently with Elon Musk. He doesn't cope well with that. So I think he wants to put the whole thing on ice. I think
Well,
he
I mean,
wants to
you
put it
bring up
on.
a really good point, and it's one of the it's a point that reflects the tension in what Trump presumably wants to achieve in his relationship or his policy towards Russia, is that he wants to better the bilateral relationship. One of the major impediments, obviously, is Ukraine, and he's trying to keep them separate. And you really can't keep them separate. All right. Um, the the sophisticated drone attack over the weekend, well, that brings the United States front and center into this conflict, and it's obviously something what that Trump doesn't want to have happen because that was attack. In a way, that was attack on the bilateral relationship. I mean, it was attack on arms control. The UK isn't part of that. Ukraine obviously isn't. And so, but that attack, and there's so many different takes you can have on it. But one of the important ones is that it puts at stake the bilateral relationship that Trump very much wants to improve. And I would point out the Russians would like that as well. Okay, and we have Senators Graham and Blumenthal hovering around, trying to spoil any kind of progress. So, I mean, it's and also that also brings up the problem where how in the world can Trump be a mediator in a conflict in which he is the major country, the U.S. is the major supporter of Ukraine? It's a knot that is impossible to undo. You can cut it, and he's afraid to do that.
Yeah, I think the Russians have miscalculated the degree to which the Americans could call Zelensky's people to order. They've assumed because it was always a long-term American aim to get Ukraine in NATO, that it's part of, as it were, Zbigniew Brzezinski's old plan, basically for US predominance. And I think that was certainly once true. But once this war got underway, things are different. Do you remember the old days in the 1960s when it was said that there were only two superpowers in the world? One was North Vietnam, and the other one was Israel, because the major superpowers simply could not control them. Why? Because they felt they were fighting for their very survival, whereas the Russians and the Americans were not. And this gives a special quality to this Russian-Ukrainian war. It has all of the flavor of the incredibly vicious conflicts that emerged in disintegrating Yugoslavia. It really does. And I think this is not within Trump's understanding of the world. And that's why I fear that having lost the opportunity of ending this war quickly, it's going to go on for a long time. It's a real learning curve. And the trouble is, Trump is going for all sorts of other objectives, which he thinks he can win quickly, like tariffs and others, which in fact he can't, because there are more complications there than he ever thought about. And then we have the issue of China and China in disarray. And then we may well, before the end of the year, have the issue of a collapse on Wall Street on the back of incredible American indebtedness as the Chinese sell American treasuries. And in the end, the US government basically devalues the dollar and goes for inflation in order to keep the economy going. In other words, what I'm getting at, there's a back to all this where things could get actually worse, far worse domestically for the United States. What that will do to the balance between the Russians, the Americans, unfortunately, all of a sudden the United States may start to seem weak instead of strong. And Russia is weakening at the moment because with the oil and gas prices, and this is a major problem for Russia. Russia's diminishing labor pool as young men go to war. There are huge problems economically in Russia, but the United States seems strong. So the trouble is the bargaining power between the two is to American advantage if the American mind is focused on the issue, but it's not. And the danger is the further out we go, the weaker United States will get.
Well, one problem for the United States is, of course, this transatlantic alliance. And we saw this in a demonstration of that in the Oval Office with Chancellor Merz and President Trump. They were clearly talking past each other. They was pretending, oh, we're in agreement, we're united. But clearly they're not united and they're talking past each other. And Merz brought up June the 6th, essentially, well, this is what we require from the United States today. What they did on June the 6th, 1944, somehow a big military effort, big effort to liberate Europe. And that means liberate Europe from Russia. And I think this is the problem. Unless the United States can cut itself off from Europe and say, we are going to take this peace process or whatever by the scruff of the neck and we're going to dictate it, then essentially the Europeans are going to prevail. It'll be this European consensus within NATO will push the United States further and further down the path of greater involvement and greater escalation. And I think that unless you can actually cut this relationship and make clear that we, the United States, are running the show, then I think it's NATO, and that means the Germans, the British, and the French. They're going to be shaping this Ukraine policy.
I think it looks that way from rhetoric. The Europeans have cornered the market in war hysteria on the subject of Ukraine without actually doing very much. You must remember, within Europe, we are drifting to the right. Even in Britain, reform, the strength of reform, which came from nowhere, is outmaneuvering even the Conservative Party. In Germany, Merz, the electorate rejected him and his party, okay. But the AfD, which is on the extreme right, they don't want. Hungary is in control, is under the control of the extreme right. In the Netherlands, the right is now pushing to take prime ministerial office. The policies of net zero, of green, and all the rest of it are crashing to the ground. And in France, they only managed to sustain themselves against the extreme right by using the legal system against Marine Le Pen. So in other words, the Europe that one presupposed was once coherent and a coherent body with which the United States could deal is actually drifting away from the center and is drifting away in the manner that the old establishment is no longer accepted. The old establishment that had NATO in its heart is really no longer accepted. And the idea that everybody in Europe is going to be forced to rearm when the European economy is not in a good way and the British economy in an even worse way, I think doesn't stand up. And that for that reason, when I read Russian commentary, despite all the hysteria in Western and Central Europe, they don't even bother to cover much of this at all anymore. It's to them in the center, it's irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. The only real discussion is with the US and then Russia, Ukraine. So I'm afraid when I've discussed this drift we have in Washington, we don't have a substitute in Europe. And whatever the Germans do, I wrote on my blog, if the Germans are rearming for 2030 or something or other, they expect they're going to rearm and wait for the Russians to have Germany rearmed.
Well,
This is a
in my program yesterday, I had a young British fellow, and we were talking exactly about this. And I asked him, I said, "So, what percentage of young men will accept conscription?" And he just laughed. He said, no, no, "Conscription is not going to go down in the UK. I mean, it's a talking point." Let's switching gears a little bit. So much has been talked about what's been going on in the two meetings in Istanbul. What is your assessment of that? Is it just kabuki theater on both sides? Because that's how a lot of people are portraying it. I would point out is that in looking at the Russian delegation and the points, their memorandum, as it were, as it's being called, it's pretty similar to for them, it's Istanbul 2.0. But it looks like it's really come to a dead end. There is talk of a third meeting, but it seems that it's just been relegated to prisoner exchanges and things like that. Do both sides want to keep that door open just in case? Because it hasn't really procured any kind of results.
yes, I think they do. I think we talk about prisoner exchange as though this is a minor thing, but I think it's very important because it fixes on something. There, there are elements of common interest between the two warring sides. This may be minimal, but it's remarked upon in the Russian hardline press that these meetings are going ahead and that prisoner exchange has happened. And remember that when you see them lined up, as I have too, I was trying to add up. I'd never seen delegations of this size before. And the Ukrainians on the right, sort of in military fatigues, often young men. And on the left, the Russians, who looked like a lot of them ready for retirement. Um, and but it's when they break up and they use the facilities and they have a coffee and a bun or something, and the hosts introduce people to one another. I couldn't quite identify in those delegations, but within each delegation, there will be somebody in Russia from the special services or something or other, and on the Ukrainian side, who should go find their counterpart and talk to them. So I think any framework should be encouraged.
Well, Professor, it's reported here that there are actually quite a few informal conversations during breaks and whatnot. And I think your description of it's very good. It looks very rigid and they hard line both sides and all that. But when the cameras are away and the hosts maybe have to go use the facilities, there is a lot of chit chat going on. Exactly, looking for your counterpart. You have a certain portfolio. By the way, there's quite a bit of chatter about that here, and it has mixed reviews. But I agree with you. I mean, there isn't a huge difference between them. They're very similar people, okay, and they do recognize that.
Yes, I mean it's the very similarity that creates such ferocity, such sore feeling, I think. Yeah. But the Russians are very, I've noticed in recent comment, are very dogmatic. They do not want intermediaries. I always imagined in my fondness, because as you know, the April 22 opening was by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's now an opposition leader. He tried to intermediate, and it all blew up. And I always had a sense that the Turks hosting things were also interested in intermediation, and that China might be as well. But China's relations with the United States are so fraught, and China is so absorbed in its domestic economic crisis that it really isn't a player in this business. So what it means is the Russians are very insistent. It has to be head to head, but between Russia and the United States. but the Americans in current conditions are not ready for this. I
But
think the Russians
yes.
have to realize this. The you mentioned this extraordinary use of drones in the attack, well within Russian boundaries. It seemed almost impossible. You could drive trucks thousands of miles into Russia with the roof covered over with drones inside. I mean, the very fact these, not the, there's the fact they destroyed these aircraft, these 40 or so aircraft, but the fact they took this equipment so far within Russia and nobody stopped them en route. All of them got through. Now, when those drones went off, of course, and people realized it, the drivers were attacked, and these guys are sitting in some awful prison somewhere. But the fact is, they got away with it. What does this say? It said that.
Well, Professor, when you say who's they? Who
Sorry,
who got
you
away with it? You said they got away
Ukrainians.
with it. Who's
Yeah,
they?
the Ukrainians. Yeah, the Ukrainians who took
Just the Ukrainians?
who. Yeah, I reckon. I mean, they may have hired a few people, but
MI6 wasn't involved in it. CIA wasn't involved in it.
I don't want to belittle MI6.
Hey,
I
but
just
I
don't.
mean, in all
The
fairness, Professor,
I
that
no,
is what people are talking about.
I
That's
know
what's
that's what our esteemed Russian ambassador in London is getting hysterical about. I'm not sure about that. I'm really not sure. It doesn't sound to me like, or certainly none of the people directly involved will have been special forces from Britain, but they wouldn't have been MI6. They would have been SAS or etc.
so there's no British fingerprints on this at all.
No, I would reckon not. Now, in planning, I'm sure every facility will have been given. But these would have been military people. These wouldn't have been MI6. They're desk Johnnies. They're not.
But go on. You were going to say, what does that tell you? You said that they got so
No,
far.
but it's quite extraordinary. It means for Putin that, and it means for the population of Russia who've learnt about it, it means that their borders are porous. They can't even defend their own country against marauding enemy coming over in trucks, for goodness sake.
Agreed. That was it's a egregious security breach, but does it change the reality on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Exactly. I
Does
well,
yes or no? Does it change?
well, I think the point is that the battlefield on the Ukraine is one of the battlefields. The larger battlefield is in Russia itself. And the Ukrainians have increasingly, as has gone on, been able to reach into Russia itself. This is where this war becomes, I think, for Putin himself, dangerous, unpredictable, unsustainable in some ways. I think it was critical. Now, you say, well, did the West have much involved? Obviously, the location of the airfields, the aircraft chosen, which were some of them were equivalent of, our
P-52. Yeah,
reconnaissance bombers,
P-52s.
etc. Yeah, I'm sure the West provided everything they could. But the idea Ukrainians were incapable of driving these trucks over on their own, I find absurd.
But there's also the
Um,
satellite guidance. I mean,
Yeah.
when you release these drones, I mean, you have to organize the trajectory. The trajectory has been such that it misses the air defenses, and that requires very
no, but
sophisticated satellite guidance. So it's
no,
more
no,
than just a location. You need the
no,
satellite guidance for the drones.
no, not in this case. Those trucks were right. If you watch the film, those trucks are right, but very, very close to those airfields.
Right, but even so, you can miss. I mean, you to be able to hit the target, you're going to need some guidance. Otherwise, you're going to miss. I mean, that's
Yeah, you probably do, but I don't know enough about the technology, but I really it's not on it, what's extraordinary about it is the sort of minuscule scale in which this was done. It's sort of micro strategy.
Yeah, but I mean, it extraordinary. It's a spectacle. We can use all kinds of words we want, but I mean, what is the point of doing it? Is to humiliate Russia? That they succeeded in that. To bolster Western support. It seems as if, I mean, if you look at the commentary of, the senators Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham and a lot of other people. George, you can help me with my memory here. It's going to be very bad. It's going to be dangerous. You'll regret it. This kind of thing. All, and right up to the second Istanbul meeting, and then we have this drone attack. I mean, it does seem there were plenty of people in the know. Maybe they didn't know exactly what the operation was, but they something's going to happen type thing. Because from a military point of view, 40 planes were not destroyed. Okay, I don't, the BBC does such a huge disservice. Planes were destroyed, but they were strategic aircraft that were not used in the Ukraine conflict. For all we know, a lot of them could have already been decommissioned and just sitting on the tarmac. We don't know. Okay, but sure, it was a spectacle. But what is its military value?
No, I mean, war is a continuation of politics. Its political value is inestimable. I think this is incredibly damaging to Putin's image, that somehow their hinterland is safe, but Ukraine is not. The battlefield, as you said, is in Ukraine. And the thing that really unsettles them is when that battlefield extends across into their own territory. And in moral terms, it should, because they invaded Ukraine. Ukraine's defending itself. It has every right to attack the Russians. The Russians have no reason to complain.
Should
This
the
is a
West be
real
should the West be involved in that?
this is a real problem
Should the
for
West be involved in that?
not directly,
Okay.
not directly.
I think we have a really misunderstanding about the word direct and indirect, but we'll let that go.
Well, no, I mean, it's obvious that if there is a direct attack of any sort, but the NATO, particularly Britain, well, it says so, but the United States have been aiding Ukraine in informal warfare from 2014, and this is an extension of it. But I don't think you're going to find Brits driving these lorries across Ukraine.
Nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying
All
that.
right, all right.
Nobody's saying that.
How does Russia now respond to this? Trump, in his the truth that he sent out after his conversation with Putin, said, "Well, Russia's going to respond vigorously," and Trump seemed to say, "Well, there's nothing much I can do about it. We're just going to have to
Yeah.
suck it up." Do you think Russia will now respond in any particularly strong, vigorous way, or
Well, yeah, this is the difference between the two, isn't it? Well, so the Russian response is a massive bombardment of Ukraine.
It's already
And
started. It's already
yeah,
started.
yeah, that's on. You can see it on YouTube today. It's very difficult to tell because the bombardment took place at night time. I mean, early this morning, it started. But the thing is, what this reveals is the extraordinary difference between the two sides. There's a subtlety and a sophistication on the Ukrainian side, which Ukrainians from the elite will tell you that would be to be expected, and the Russian, a total lack of imagination. The lack of imagination into how to deal with this war in Ukraine is to revert to, the great days of Kursk and the rest of it in World War II. You just send the bodies in and you blow the hell out of the enemy, and somehow this will result in the end of the war.
But it
Um,
did. But it did.
uh,
It did
yeah,
end the
but the
Second World
idea that this would be repeated in a war against Ukraine, yeah, I'm not. I study all that stuff, but it's the lack of flexibility because Russia sees itself as the great bear and can't help but behave like the great bear.
Well, I mean, Professor, I mean, can I push back? I mean, so Russia should be derailing civilian trains and blowing up bridges.
It
Is that,
already
I
does.
mean, you call that's sophisticated.
It's been doing that since 2014 in eastern Ukraine. That's not new.
Targeting civilian trains.
That's
Okay.
what they have special forces for. They've been doing that all along. That's nothing new.
Are these
And to
assassinations?
get
What's the
to
equivalent of the assassination of Dugina? What is the equivalent that the Russians did against the Ukrainians? Is there an equivalent?
I have no knowledge of that. I have no
Okay,
knowledge.
well, either do I, because I don't think it has happened. One of the issues that George and I have focused a lot on over the last couple of weeks that I think should get a lot more attention is what's going on in the Baltic Sea. Because even though I think the outcome of the war in Ukraine is obvious, it's a matter of time. We can disagree on that, obviously, but it seems that NATO has future ambitions. I mean, whatever happens in Ukraine is going, whatever that outcome is going to be, NATO is going to still be very aggressive. What's been going on in the Baltic Sea is we see a great deal of escalation, and I think we could add that with the Black Sea. So NATO still has its ambitions as this conflict goes on.
Yeah, if you see NATO as I don't see NATO as quite so cohesive. I mean, the Baltic states, the Estonians in particular, who have their own, as it were, more localized objectives. Um, Sweden now, Sweden along with Norway and Finland, are finding their feet as allies in the region. I don't see, and there's a lot of, I don't know if you look at the British press, but there are always these hysterical pieces suggesting the Russians are now going to lumber over the Baltic, over the border, and you can always get an Estonian spokesman.
Yeah,
It,
George and I are the leading experts on the Shadow Fleet. Okay,
yeah,
we report on the Shadow Fleet very often. Yes.
yeah. So, and there were always, remember the old days, there were always these Russian submarines turning up in Swedish territorial waters. Um, there is an area of major conflict. That the major conflict there is with Russian aircraft um, overflying British bases in Scotland and Lincolnshire, and as it were constantly the RAF is constantly on alert. They have forces out in the Baltic states on rotation. So the as it were the provocative activity is in the air rather than at sea in that area. But I think Putin wants to stay focused on, and you mentioned the Black Sea, particularly the Black Sea, particularly the connection with Ukraine. For him, that is an emotional issue. It's not just a strategic issue. It's an identification with Catherine the Great's legacy, and he's got himself into a major mess.
You
And
think he's going to continue with, when you talk about the Black Sea, that he wants essentially to take the Ukraine's Black Sea ports? I mean, is that part of the plan?
oh yeah, I mean the Russian. Well, he's gone back to Stalin's policy in 45, 46. He wants the Black Sea as a mare clausum. He wants that as a Russian sea, and with no one allowed to come in across the straits. And but at the moment, he's in no position to push those issues. But um, I think there's a lot of I don't know. I just have a feel that there are a lot of scenarios being played in Moscow on these various issues. In other words, what if the Americans say, right, we're going to restrict this to the land, a settlement, well, a ceasefire on land only in Ukraine? Well, where does that leave Crimea? Where does that leave the Black Sea? What if the Americans then agree a separate set of agreements in relation to the borders and the Black Sea? What do we do then? Where will the Turks sit? In other words, I think there are a lot of scenarios being worked out that, as it were, like a jigsaw puzzle, that of variations of agreement. So I don't think the Russians are being idle at home in respect of trying to work these things out, they need to connect with the Americans. What I find disturbing on the American side is the absence of Russian specialists anywhere involved in
Yeah.
these things. And it may be that Trump, having gone through Trump term one, is suspicious of them all as he was then, because they're tied in CIA and the rest of it. But I find it bewildering that he should send people to Moscow like Witkoff and others to negotiate who have no understanding or direct knowledge of Russia at all. I'm not saying you need to put some academic in charge of these things, but if you're going to put together a little delegation, you want Russian speakers. You want people who know the place on the ground, including former director of CIA. But Trump has just thrown them aside. I don't think Marco Rubio wants those people. And we hear nothing from CIA. Perhaps it's about time we heard nothing from CIA. But in this respect, that's what the Russians are looking for. They're saying, where are our counterparts? Who are the people we're used to talking to? Remember, Lavrov is
one of the examples is that they basically said, "Don't send Keith Kellogg. We don't want to talk to
well,
him."
yes.
Yeah.
Well, well, you know what Trump is like. Trump is very amusing. He always insists on hiring the highest level generals he can find in order finally to humiliate them by sacking them. Um, there's this sort of I've got my because he went to military school, didn't he? So he wants to show that he can command all the generals in the field. I just and the trouble is when you employ specialists or people of great experience, I'm not talking about the military, but on the Russian side, the trouble is you're then going to have to listen to them. That will not go down well. In other words, there would have to be a negotiation within the American delegation in order to find out what positions they can adopt and succeed in pushing past the Russians. This is a real problem. So what I'm getting at is since Trump came to office, my forlorn hope that this could be settled quickly, or if not, then it would take a long time. They have so much preparation to do. And I've not heard anything from anybody. Well, perhaps they stopped talking to me in Washington. Oh, I've been rung up by the White House. Oh, the National Security Council wanted to see me next week, give them a briefing on this or that.
Yes.
Not a word.
Going back to Istanbul, we touched on that. And, we had the Russian memorandum, we had the Ukrainian memorandum, and superficially say, well, they're miles apart. But if you look at the memoranda, there may be some basis of agreement. Remember, the Russians have put forward two scenarios for a ceasefire. The first scenario is the one that Putin articulated last July, total withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the four oblasts. But in lieu of that, there's an alternative, which is, okay, there's a ceasefire, but no delivery of weapons to Ukraine from NATO, no intelligence delivery for Ukraine. That could be a basis for something. I mean, those are two different scenarios that the Russians have put forward. You could say, okay, then there would have to be limitations on the size of Ukrainian forces. But now there's a story today in RT saying that that the Ukrainians were actually willing to maybe discuss limitations on Ukrainian forces. So maybe there could be something between those two positions.
What George is getting at is that it's come to light that there's at least two Ukrainian
Right.
memoranda out
That's right.
there. One was for the West, and one was more, I guess, for internal purposes or for just Russian eyes only.
So there could be something. I don't know. To look on a more optimistic basis.
Yeah, I don't think either side need be limited by what's on paper.
Mm.
If there is a will to produce a settlement, there would be, as it were, shadow negotiations, as was suggested. There would be shadow negotiations at the negotiations, and then there would be exchanges, and then there would be follow through. I think but I do believe that the longer the two leaderships stay apart and are not even shouting at one another in one room, this is not good. Putin has to have his hand in it. There has to be, even though he loathes Zelensky and Zelensky loathes him, he has to be in a room with Zelensky, with the Americans. This has to happen as soon as possible. Then the Americans will be educated, Trump will be educated directly as to what the limits are. And the other side may then both find his idea of what peace should be, or even a ceasefire should be, actually draws them closer together. In other words, I just think that doing this from a distance with delegations of officials of those two sides without the Americans involved is not the most helpful way to proceed. But if the Americans are unwilling to go in there, except on their own conditions, there's nothing the other two sides can do about it. And I really
but you've already told us that you don't believe that the Americans are even capable of
not
doing
well,
it.
not this side. I don't. It's not to do with capability. I think it's to do with how much Trump can retain in his head at any moment. I just think until we've got through November,
Of next
and
year, not this year.
the advantage of
Next year is the midterms.
Right, next year. So we've got some time till then. Though.
Yeah, I know, but you know the mindset. But yeah, no, we do have some time. But I personally, this has got nothing to do with the war. I'm more worried about the American economy and the stock market. And if it's going to crash, it's going to crash between September and November. And America will then look in on itself, will be focused in
Well,
on.
also another thing we can look forward to, according to a lot of punditry, is we can look forward to an attack on Iran. So the second half of this year is going to be really quite busy. Professor, let me ask you a question because something that I've always been very curious about. Um, you're in the UK. You make reference to British media when we talk. Where does British Russophobia come from?
That's what the Russians always ask. When did we do anything bad to Britain? This is
No, I know because I
no,
live here.
no, yeah,
I've been here for 27 years, and Russians they don't have really kind of any attitude towards the British.
yeah,
remarkably, they don't really have, up until recently, they really don't have any actually strong feelings against the Germans. I mean, they just don't think in those, they don't talk about it, they don't think about it. And it's a cottage industry here. Anytime, particularly in the British press, it's instantly translated into Russian for everybody to read, and it's appalling some of the things, the claims and historical claims that are fictitious and all that. I mean, where does it come from? It seems so visceral, and most visceral from the UK.
well, firstly, it's got nothing to do with the British people. This country is run by an establishment which at the moment reform is trying to overthrow, and most of the consensus within that establishment has got absolutely nothing to do with popular opinion. The second point is that this is a revival of animosities that were very strong during the latter Cold War. And the retired generals, we've got enough retired generals to fill out a regiment. And they just, they never got their chance to go out and kill Russians. And some of them, they're completely off the wall in this regard. The Whitehall has basically far too many paid up propagandists whose role is to obfuscate and frighten people in the idea that we're going to face a war with Russia, that we should have conscription, and that certain of my colleagues, like Richard Sakwa, should be blacklisted. And these aren't people in favor of old-fashioned British values. These people are sort of trying to wind us up for World War III as though we're now in 1938 with the danger of a peace conference where Ukraine will be sliced up with the Russians. So what you're referring to is the expression of the British military establishment, which I just regard as completely bonkers. I mean, and I think most of the population, if it hears about it, just turns the page and, well, nobody reads the mass media anymore. But if it were presented with the Daily Telegraph or whatever, just move on and read something else. Because remember, in Britain, we've got a huge industry writing military history. Even bigger, I think, than the American industry writing military history. The Americans tend to be much more focused on battles and particular operations in World War II. The British like this grand sweep. Oh, I remember the Crimean War, what we were doing in India and all the rest of it. So I wouldn't take that seriously, and I wouldn't underestimate hostility to Britain from within the Russian Foreign Ministry.
Oh, well,
Intelligence
I
services.
know many people in the Russian foreign ministry, and but very privately they just think, well, you use the word, these people are bonkers. Okay.
So what about France's Russophobia? Because that's a little more surprising because France traditionally has been Russophile. There's been the long alliances before World War II, alliance before World War One.
Yeah.
The French Russophobia, that's surprising.
Well, you shouldn't ask a Brit to comment on the French. And French Foreign Ministry, which I always have a soft touch for because they're incredibly professional, and when they learn a language, they know a language. I'm not talking about other foreign ministries like that. And they have always been tough-minded on Russia. They have been consistent that you couldn't, even during the period of greatest détente, even when the Soviet Union collapsed, my French colleagues were as Russophobe as they had been before. So there is a section of academia who weren't in the Communist Party, but some of them had been and then flipped. But there was a strong section amongst the elite who are very Russophobe. I don't know how seriously they should be taken. I wouldn't say with the general public, once again, that one should generalize, because a lot of the French press was, particularly Le Monde and others, were fairly benign about the Soviet Union during some of the worst periods of the Cold War. So I wouldn't generalize about that. The Elysee is something different, and as we know, Mr. Macron is something different. It's whatever is convenient to him. And Mr. Macron, as you know, immediately the Russians invaded, was anxious to talk to them about what, I've no idea. Rather like when Gorbachev was overthrown on the Black Sea, the French were interested in recognizing the new government as soon as possible. So there's a degree of flexibility from the Elysee that we see, and that we should never mistake for something more fundamental.
But it's,
Well,
it's in a way, it's a. I was
right
just going to
ahead.
follow up on that. In a way, it does flow from this, the anti-communism, anti-Marxism that took hold, became fashionable in France, because up until the 1970s, it used to be kind of leftish, Marxist, pro-communist. But the emergence of the new philosophers, particularly horrible Bernard-Henri Lévy and André Glucksmann and all these people, they kind of helped turn French public opinion against communists, against Marxists, and then against the Soviet Union, and eventually against Russia.
I think that, yeah, we're getting into deep waters here. I think this was to do with the crisis within the French Socialist Party, because I knew people involved. And what happened there was that during the crisis, because, are we socialists? Are we not socialists? We Mitterrand and the rest of it, there was a tendency among some of them to take a very, very hard anti-communist position in order to try to extricate Mitterrand from this very strange melange of people that he got himself into. There was they felt there was a danger that the old socialist, communist, Front Populaire sort of 1930s, etc., was in danger of re-emerging. Mitterrand, I think he always felt that he could control the devil, and that he would rather have them on the inside for a while than on the outside spitting in. So I just think that there's a Machiavellian element to French politics that Anglo-Saxons tend to underestimate, and when you see it there, it's there with Britain and the United States. But when you think you see it there in France, it doesn't mean it's there. It's some reflection. You need to be careful about tackling that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of European or Western Russophobia is it's just in the eye of the beholder at a certain time, and it has a lot to do with, as you were pointing out, the conditions of the body politic at the time.
Exactly.
I always find it very. I lived in Poland for 10 years, and Russophobia in Poland has its own specific characteristic. It's very interesting. I mean, I think that, George and I, we should do an anthology of European and Western Russophobia. I think it would be a very interesting exercise because you have different takes.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's domestic politics in continental Europe. It's domestic politics that was driving the attitudes to Russia, whether you look in Italy or in France or wherever, and you look in Germany today with the AfD, and you look in Hungary, there's a sort of opportunism to foreign policy which is being played out. Is
Hmm.
being played out. So if you're against NATO, you're against the centralization of EU, you probably look more benignly on Russia. This is
Hmm.
basically what's happening.
So it's like the right has become the pro, so to speak, the pro-Russian, using just media crude terms like pro-Russian, like the AfD in Germany, Orban, the Le Pen in France.
Yes,
So it's the sort of the neoliberal, middle of the roaders who are the most Russophobic.
I think what it's maybe difficult for some in North America to see, but foreign policy in Europe is small change for domestic policy. In other words, you will make use of it. It doesn't have an end in itself, certainly not since the creation of the European Union.
Hmm.
It's become so distant dealing with other powers, and it's not the same thing as in North America, and it's certainly not the same thing as in Britain.
Well, Professor Haslam, thank you very much again for a really fascinating conversation. So many ideas,
And
throughout
please,
that.
Please go into deep waters anytime you want. We like that. We like
Yeah,
that.
we love
Our
deep
viewers
waters.
like that. Okay.
Well, yeah, you threw me a life belt in this discussion. I'm very grateful for it on America. So I'm always in need of extra education on that front.
So thank you very much, Professor, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.